hello everyone, and welcome to another Scots Whay podcast. And we're down the pub. It's always good to meet right. It's down the pub with Iain Maloney. Hello, Iain.
Hello.
So usually we ask people to come around the corner, or we travel to Edinburgh at the very furthest, but you've made it over from Japan.
Yes.
And you're here to promote your new novel, The Waves Burn Bright. I think one of the things you can tell from the book, which we'll talk about just now, is the distinct sense of place. Now, I mentioned earlier, I know Aberdeen a bit, but you absolutely, it's quite a difficult thing to do, I think, is to get that so spot on. You mentioned that some of your old haunts are in there, and even some of your old workplaces are in there. Was this a deliberate thing to kind of write about a place that you knew so well?
Yes, it was a deliberate thing to write about Aberdeen.
Yeah.
That much. I've always felt that in the kind of canon of Scottish literature, Aberdeen's been tragically underrepresented.
I think so. I think I would agree with that.
There's plenty of novels set in Glasgow and plenty set in Edinburgh, and that's fantastic. That's wonderful. But Aberdeen less so. I mean, there are some great ones, obviously. You know, Sunset Song set in that area, and Stuart McBride's done a series of crime novels. But yeah, in terms of, for want of a better word, literary fiction, there's not a huge amount. So
yeah, and in the past it has been like Grasset Gibbon Rural or even to do with fishing. But this is based around one of the biggest events in Scotland's recent history, and it's the Piper Alpha disaster, and that's central to the book. Again, something I don't think in fiction has been dealt with. I might be wrong about that. Certainly, I've never come across it.
As far as I know, it hasn't. There's 3 non-fiction books that I'm aware of, 2 kind of journalistic ones, and 1 survivor's memoir by a guy called Ed Punchard, who's a diver in Piper Alpha. And there's been a couple of plays, like a radio play and something on the Lemon Tree in Aberdeen. But in terms of fiction, as far as I know, nothing.
So, did the idea to write it with the disaster centrally, or was it something else that sparked the book?
There was a number of things that went into it. Piper Alpha is, I think I call it in the book, it's an event horizon in the history of Aberdeen.
Yeah.
In the way that Hillsborough for Liverpool or the Pan Am bombing for Lockerbie is so central to the history of the character of those places. Piper Alpha is like that for Aberdeen. So for a long time I didn't want to write about it. I didn't want to touch it. It's, you know, it's in many ways it's like an open wound, and you just don't want to go there. But as I say, I wanted to write about the city. I wanted to write about Aberdeen as kind of as a character in itself, and the Aberdeen I knew, the Aberdeen I grew up in, and the Aberdeen I miss when I'm in Japan.
Sure.
But it slowly became clearer and clearer that I couldn't do that without dealing with Piper Alpha in quite a central way, not just mention it in the background.
Yeah, sure.
I kind of had to tackle it head on if I wanted to write the book I wanted to write. So
how, I mean, I can imagine you would approach that with the utmost kind of respect and delicacy. How did you go about it? How did you do that?
The first thing, the most difficult thing, was finding a way to approach it.
Yeah.
I knew what I didn't want to do. I knew there was things, I didn't want to do like the literary equivalent of a disaster movie and have, one night on Piper Alpha.
Sure.
I didn't want to go there, and I didn't want to write a book about the real people, the survivors and the people who actually died there. I didn't want to put my words and my thoughts into the mouths and minds of real people.
Yeah.
I mean, Piper Alpha was only 28 years ago this year. Yeah. So many of the survivors are still alive, the families are still alive. These are still very raw memories for a lot of people, so I didn't want to kind of presume to speak for anyone.
You say one of the characters in the book, Marcus, you give the figures and you say, well, he's the +1. I'm not this is not based on anyone, this is absolutely a fictional survivor.
Yeah, there was 226 people in Piper Alpha. Marcus is a fictional 227th. So.
And what the book also deals with is the aftermath of such a tragedy and how coping's the wrong word, I think, but what the fallout from something like this can be. It's kind of clear in the book that it's because Peter and Marcus's family really, and his relationship in particular with his daughter. And it would be easy, I think, to blame what unfolds on the tragedy, but you make it kind of clear that things were not great before that anyway. There's a scene when they're on holiday in the beginning. Well, if you just tell us a little bit about that particular situation.
Yeah, the book, chronologically, the book starts 8 years before Piper Alpha, when Marcus, his wife Hannah, and his daughter Carrie, who's 7 years old or 8 years old at the time, are on holiday in Japan. And at that point, it's clear that Marcus and Hannah's marriage is not in the best of shapes. There's lots of arguing, suspected infidelities on Marcus's part, and this is all seen through Carrie's eyes as a young child, overhearing her parents arguing. So
I think for me that was a great thing to do, because it would have been too easy, I think, to say here's people's lives which have disconnected, which in certain cases have fallen apart, and it's because of what happened on this night. But it's not as easy as that. Life isn't as neat and easy as that. But what Piper Alpha does do is one that sets it very much in a time and place. And it also sets, I think, what you said you wanted to write about the Aberdeen Union, it sets Aberdeen very much in a time and place where, and I might be wrong about this, but the oil industry was changing then anyway.
Yeah, I mean, 86, I think I'm right in saying 86 was a particularly bad point in the oil industry. It almost mirrors now. The oil prices slumped hugely. There was redundancies, there was big problems, big stresses, but it was still in some ways still kind of the early point of the oil boom, when it was still, there was huge money pouring into Aberdeen. You get, as a kid, I always got stories of what Aberdeen was like in the 70s and 80s, where all the Texans were in with their big cowboy hats and cowboy boots, waving around wads of notes. But 86 sort of killed the prices a bit, and then 88 with Piper Alpha was in many ways sort of the end of the innocent period, I guess, of the oil industry.
I think that's probably a great way of putting it, because I think people thought from the outside probably, wow, Aberdeen, is just paved with gold, or paved with black gold anyway. And this was a reminder that actually what was going on up there was incredibly dangerous again. And actually,
it's international world.
The resources were being exploited again. Would you say that's fair?
Exploited. They were certainly being drained. I mean, all that money that didn't quite pave the streets with gold, because most of it just flowed through and straight back out the other side.
We have
but it's Aberdeen always had before Piper Alpha, the oil industry was offshore, in both metaphorically and literally. That it was over the horizon. You couldn't see the oil rigs. You couldn't actually see what was being done. Piper Alpha was 120 miles offshore, so people could, unless you were actually physically going out there, people could sort of put it out of mind and just enjoy the house prices going up and not really have to deal with it. But that all changed that night. After that, it was, Piper Alpha was part of the city.
It wasn't disconnected anymore. No, because what I thought about when I was reading it was, a few different books and mentioned how that area maybe hasn't been represented in literature. But going back to the Cheviot Stag and the Black Oil, and obviously which is a play which looks at how resources were being taken, and people as well being taken out and exploited. And I don't know whether you meant this, but that's one of the things I got from the book as well, that again, maybe exploited's the wrong word, but
it certainly changed things because I mean, when I was growing up, and particularly when I went to university, so I started in 1998 at Aberdeen. Aberdeen's living costs in Aberdeen are much higher,
right,
in terms of compared with salary than most places in the country. So for example, when I started university in '98, when you were applying for your student loan, they initially spoke about having a London version,
right,
an Aberdeen version, and then everywhere else.
So kind of waiting version, right?
Yeah, so it's kind of, we know your rent's much higher than any sort of part-time job you're going to get while you're a student. And they ended up scrapping that and just having London and everywhere else. But it is a huge problem even today for people in Aberdeen that don't work directly for the oil industry, because the housing prices are huge, and just the cost of things, the cost of living, the cost of beer, food and things is really high compared with what people outside the oil industry
so
sometimes earn.
Maybe is a little bit like London. If you work in the service industry or something like that, you're very likely not to be living directly in the city centre.
Exactly, yeah. It's I mean, Aberdeen's much smaller, so the city centre is never that far away from anywhere.
Yeah, that's true enough. That's true.
Yeah, definitely.
I always think chucking out time on Union Street's one of the most glorious sights I've ever seen in Scotland. But that's another story. So you mentioned at the beginning that you are over from Japan, where you live now. You're working over there. I guess that gives you a different perspective at home.
It does, yeah. I've been asked this before, and I've never quite been able to make up my mind about it. There's the obvious distance gives you some sort of objectivity. You can look back, and certainly living in Japan's an interesting situation, because in many ways it's very similar. Both parliamentary democracies, capitalist economies, and so on. But in other ways, they're very, very different societies. So it gives a good opportunity to compare and contrast and see, well, I love this about Scotland and it's not so great in Japan, but in Japan they do this better than they do in Scotland.
Sure, okay.
So it's good from that point of view. But I also feel like pretty much every emigrant writer in history just ends up writing about home. Maybe not all the time, but I think it's somebody like James Joyce, only ever really wrote about Dublin, despite not being there for decades. Stevenson wrote the South Sea Stories and the Bottling, but he still also wrote stories set in Scotland. I think he was writing the Weir of Harmston, who's writing when he died, who's still right to the end.
I mean, I still say that Jekyll and Hyde is basically set in Edinburgh.
Yes,
no matter what,
exactly. So it's unplanned, but this is my third novel, and all three have been set in Scotland, various points in history. But
some of this is set in Japan as well. Set in
Japan, in Hawaii, in New Zealand, a little bit in Korea, a little bit in Durham. So it moves all over the place, which it's something I've wanted to do for a while. It's, as I say, it's an accident that I've written kind of 3 Scottish books. The book before my first novel, First Time Solo, I wrote a book called Dog Mountain that was it's unpublished, it wasn't good enough, but it was entirely set in Japan with entirely Japanese characters. Then when I finished that, I started First Time Solo, and since then I haven't returned to writing about Japan. So in this one I was like, I want it. Pull some of that experience in.
Book,
it is. It is.
But on the going back to Piper Alpha disaster, did the distance as well as the time lend a different perspective of it? Because I presume, maybe I'm wrong, but I presume you spoke to people who weren't Scottish about maybe if they had any memory of it. I mean, it's something that's not very strongly with me. I remember it very clearly. But
one thing that surprised me when I first started thinking about maybe I could do this, but maybe I could write about Piper Alpha, I spoke to people in Aberdeen and said, you know what, if somebody said they were going to write a book about Piper Alpha, what would you think? To get their reaction. Because as you said before, this is something that I wanted to approach with sensitivity and respect. So I wanted to kind of gauge reaction before I did anything. But a lot of people outside Scotland that I spoke to had maybe heard the name but didn't really know anything about it.
Okay.
And certainly anyone I spoke to, even in Scotland, younger than me, so I'm 35, so anyone younger than me who was not directly connected to Aberdeen or to the oil and gas industry, they'd never heard of it. They didn't know what it was. So, and that kind of shocked me, that it's, you know, if you think about how well Hillsborough is remembered, or Lockerbie, I mean Hillsborough is slightly different because the conspiracy and the controversy, but how fresh those events still are in people's memory. And Hillsborough was only a year after Piper Alpha, so it's the same kind of
or even other things like Bradford City, and there are other things that I don't know, it'd be interesting to think about the difference between something that happens, I suppose, at people's work, which is what Piper Alpha was but have you had any kind of negative response when people have heard what you're writing about?
I haven't had any negative response. I've had a lot of what I would describe as teeth sucking when I first mention it.
I always wait to do
it. Say, you know, I've written a book about Piper Alpha. And then when I
sharp intake of bread.
When I explain what the book is, then everyone's been much more positive about it. And it is something I was really worried about. I very deliberately didn't speak to any survivors or speak to any of the families of those who died while I was writing the book, because as I said before, I didn't want to start writing about real people and putting my words into their mouths. And I thought if I started interviewing people, it would start to bring in connections, which
that's interesting.
I didn't want to do. But as soon as it was finished, I did show it to people connected to Piper Alpha to just say, look, if you find anything in this that's offensive or that's wrong or that's even slightly inaccurate, tell me and I'll fix it and I'll take it out, because I really didn't want to offend anybody. And everybody I showed it to came back and said, no, there's nothing wrong with it.
The only reason I ask is I remember seeing James Robertson at an I Write just after the book he did on Lockerbie. And there were people obviously there who hadn't read the book and actually didn't want to read the book, but were still angry about the fact that it didn't written at all.
That worried me, because obviously I'm very aware of James Robertson, and that's a great book. And it wasn't, I'm not sure what year that was published, but it wasn't that long before I started thinking about this.
At the very most 3 years ago, maybe 2 years ago.
So it was still very fresh, and that gave me pause, and that made me sit down and really think about it, the kind of reaction he had. But I think the difference with Lockerbie and with Hillsborough, from the difference between them and Piper Alpha, is the level of controversy. Piper Alpha doesn't have an Al McGrahy to worry about, or a police conspiracy to worry about. So I thought there's less possibility of really offending.
Because there's no kind of this happened or conspiracy theories surrounding it.
I mean, James Robertson's book in some ways kind of retries what happened, which I absolutely don't go into at all in this book. What actually caused Piper Alpha and whose fault it was or whose fault wasn't it. I just don't go near that. There's non-fiction books that deal with that much better than I ever could. So.
Having said that, the scenes on Piper Alpha itself are incredibly powerful. I mean, it's really stuck with me after reading it.
That's good to hear.
As they should be, absolutely,
They were.
The central relationship is this relationship between Carrie and Marcus Fisher. Why father-daughter relationship?
A number of reasons. Initially, I knew I wanted it to be a family relationship. I said before, I wasn't sure how to approach this. I knew what I didn't want to do, but I wasn't sure how to do it. And one of the books I just coincidentally happened to read at the time was Andrew O'Hagan's Our Fathers, which brilliantly takes kind of contemporary local history and family history and overlays them. And I sort of read that book and went, that's an approach. That's the way I can approach this, is to take the family and the city and sort of have one stand for the other in a way. So I knew I wanted to write about family. I didn't want to write about a father-son relationship because I've done that before. I didn't want to kind of repeat myself and go down that. And obviously Marcus had to be a man because he had to be on the oil rig.
Sure.
In the 80s there was only men. I'm not sure what I'm sure there are more women now, but certainly in the 80s it was men only. So the father-daughter relationship is an interesting one. It's very different dynamics from a father-son relationship. And when once I realised that was going to be my approach, doing it through the family, Carrie basically appeared fully formed in my head.
It reads like that, I have to say.
She just walked into my head, and as at the start of the book she's a 41-year-old woman on her way back to Aberdeen, and that's how she walked into my head, and I was like, right, that's my character. I've got my character, I've got my situation. I can approach this. Not with that clarity. I mean, with First Time Solo, because it was in many ways my first published book, but in many ways the first proper novel I'd written. There are aspects of the main character there that are very similar to me. That you know, he leaves home when he's a young man and goes somewhere new. I did that, so that was very much the borrowed aspects of my life. Selma Hill was very different because it's lots of different characters set in a kind of semi-mythical 18th century Scotland, so it was more of an ensemble. But yeah, Carrie just walked in fully formed. I'm a 41-year-old volcanologist from Aberdeen. Here's my story. And it just went. So
another character who I think is fantastic is actually the mother. I don't know why my dad's a doctor, and in the character Hannah's a doctor as well.
Surgeon.
And you mentioned the kind of lack of empathy in the family when someone's ill. I thought, hang on, this rings a bell. I was always going to show it to him. See, that's what we're talking about all the time.
When I was at university, quite a few of my friends had parents in the medical profession. My mother's a nurse as well, and everybody had the same stories. You know, I had a broken arm, and they said, "Oh, you'll be fine in the morning," or various ailments that were dismissed as being, I saw a road traffic accident today. That's nothing.
That's nothing. That's a wee stitch will do that fine. But that's certainly very true. But the whole, there's a breakdown of the relationship that you don't go into too much detail, but there's kind of, certainly within the parents, there's fault on both sides.
Yes.
What's also written very well is Marcus's dependency on alcohol, and again, done with real sensitivity and respect, which is quite rare in general. It is quite rare in Scottish writing. You know, often a drink is purely seen as this destructive thing. Now, you could be argued it's the same here, but when he kind of starts to piece his life back together, you don't do the obvious thing of saying, well, I'll never drink again and that's it. There's a much more of a kind of holistic approach to him as a character, I think.
I think the phrase self-medicating is particularly apt with Marcus, that alcohol is obviously a huge problem for him, but it's not the source of the problem. Alcohol's bandaging up the post-traumatic stress disorder and the survivor's guilt that he's suffering from, and he refuses to get professional treatment for it for various reasons that I go through in the book, and but ends up self-medicating. And there is different countries and different places have different approaches to treating post-traumatic stress disorder, and particularly alcoholism as a crutch. Crutch is a good image for it, because a lot of treatments view alcohol as a crutch and kind of think of it that if you've broken your leg, you need the crutch until the leg's mended, and then you get rid of the crutch. You don't just take it away straight away. So certainly the doctor in the book approaches it like, let's treat the post-traumatic stress disorder, and the alcoholism won't take care of itself, but that's we can treat that later. Yes.
And I think with Marcus's generation, it's still a generation that the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder was kind of not spoken about.
Yeah.
Or if it was usually with relationship to someone coming back from a war or something like that. The idea that someone, with Hillsborough so fresh in our mind, that someone would react to being involved in a tragedy like that. You mentioned survivor's guilt, which I think must be a really strong thing. He just didn't know how to deal with any of these things. In fact, there's a scene where he's basically digging the hole in the garden because he doesn't know what else to do.
Yeah, I think it was certainly. I mean, this is just anecdotal in my experience, but I would say after the first Gulf War, there was a lot more talk of post-traumatic stress disorder and treatment and dealing with it properly. The war before that was the Falklands in 84. So, and I think after that there was, certainly as far as I'm aware, there's a lot less spoken about in terms of treatment. It was all, we won from the sun and treatment of physical wounds, like people who got severely badly burnt and that kind of thing, but much less about trauma. So.
That's right, and if you think about the big American war, perhaps being Vietnam, and the lack of support that there was for guys who came back from that, it wasn't until years later, now pretty much, that people are talking about how that generation, and it almost was, when you think how many people were involved, were just left alone.
And even when, it's an interesting thing actually, it just occurred to me, even when Hollywood made all those films about the Vietnam War, nobody ever used the phrase post-traumatic stress disorder. And films like Deer Hunter and Born on the 4th of July are clearly about post-traumatic stress disorder, but as far as I remember, the words are never used in the film.
I don't think so, and just the extreme results of it. So we'll go back to some of your earlier books, because you spoke a little bit there about a first-time solo. Second World War, I think, that's right, and I remember it being jazz and military kind of camaraderie.
Jazz camaraderie and a little bit of Marxism thrown in.
Yes, there is, some of my favourite things. So why did you decide to write that book? I mean, you said you'd written one based in Japan. You maybe weren't happy with it, so you went down a different track.
I was happy with it, nobody else was. That was the problem.
That's very honest.
It got, that one, Dog Mountain, got shortlisted for the Dundee Prize in 2013, and then that's kind of as far as it got. I think that was the year, I think I'm right in saying that was the year Pippa Goldsmith won it, which is a far more deserving book by a mile. But I'd had the idea, I'd had the concept for something like First Time Solo for a very long time, probably certainly since I did my Masters, but maybe since during my undergraduate years, that I knew I wanted to not write about my grandfather's experiences in the war, but my grandfather once told me something fascinating that I'd never realised before, and I haven't heard spoken or written about much, and that was the fact that, so my grandfather joined the RAF as soon as he turned 18. You had to volunteer for the RAF, you couldn't be conscripted, you'd be conscripted for the others. And then, so he signed up in 42, went down and signed the papers in 42, didn't get called to begin his training until 43, so a year later, did his basic training, got sent to Canada to do his flight training, because at that time there was a thing called the Empire Air Training Scheme, which was basically, it was too dangerous to train pilots in Britain, because they needed the planes, needed the runways, and the Germans could shoot them down. So they sent them to, at that time, the Empire. So Canada and Rhodesia and Australia and South Africa and places like that. So my granddad went to Canada in late 43, and then they left him there until the end of the war. Because basically they didn't need any more pilots. Once Britain started winning the air war, and they were losing pilots at a far less than expected rate.
So all these young guys who were kind of became the last ones to move in.
So my granddad had said to me, he volunteered to fly and to fight and to die for his country, and ended up spending 3 years or 2.5 years in the safest place in the world. Not actually fighting. So I knew I wanted to write about that aspect of it. The Canada stuff ended up not being in the book. It was in an early draft that ended up being like a ridiculous number of words long, and didn't really hold together as a novel. So in the back of my head, there's a sequel to First Time Solo. Excellent. In the back of my head, and yeah, after finishing Dog Mountain, I felt ready. Right. To tackle, because it's a big story. Yeah, it's emotionally quite a difficult story. And when I was 18, I wasn't ready to write it. Yeah. But by the time I was 30, 31, I felt ready to tackle it.
It is. It's an emotional book. What gives the emotional heft, I think, is it's quite light-hearted to begin with, or it's quite humorous to begin with. There is, as I say, this camaraderie, the kind of young guns meeting each other and enjoying their music and chasing women and all that. And then so when it comes in, when the real tragedies start to come in, and they do quite regularly as the book unfolds, it really kind of stops you short. Oh, this wasn't the book I was reading about, 6 chapters ago. Was that a deliberate thing?
It was very deliberate. That for a lot of war novels and war films, war dramas, forget that these were real people. Yeah, absolutely. That these were 18, 19-year-old men and women who could die any day. Yeah. And so they did what 18, 19-year-olds have done for centuries, and they have fun. They go out drinking, they try and have sex with each other, they play music and hang out and get into fights and argue with each other. And I really wanted to focus on that side of things, this not people fighting in Dunkirk or across North Africa or anything like that, although that's all was obviously happening at the same time. But the people they're doing their training, they're not ready to fight yet. They're too young. But because they're training, you can't train 24 hours a day. Yeah. And Jack, the main character, he grows up in a farm in Aberdeenshire, and suddenly he's let loose in London with money in his pocket and a pilot's uniform, which all the girls love. Yeah. And what boy wouldn't go mad?
Well, exactly. I wouldn't ask which bits are autobiographical. So the character, I think the central character of Jack is basically based on your grandfather, with a little bit of yourself thrown in.
Not even. By the time I got around to writing it, it was sort of 12, 13 years after the initial idea. So any connection with my grandfather by that point had gone. Right, okay. My grandfather contributed hugely in terms of research, in terms of details, and the training follows my grandfather's training. So I went through, my granddad very kindly gave me his logbook to look through, so like literally what he did every day, how many left turns and how many right turns in the training plane, that kind of thing, so I could go through it and make sure it was all correct. But Jack himself and any character in the story really bear very little connection. Okay. He wasn't even a farmer. He grew up in Peterhead. Was the son of a chemist. So.
They do share a love of jazz. Is that something that you're willing to admit on?
I honestly don't know what my grandfather's taste in music are. I know my grandmother loved going to dances and things like that. So, and it was it was the popular music at the time. So
that was why basically their music interests surrounded that music, because it was the hip new.
It was the hip. I mean, I love jazz as well myself, and I made Jack a trumpet player because I'd love to have learned the trumpet. But I wanted.
And it's got quite. You're talking about war films, and it's got quite a cinematic feel. I felt when I was reading it. You could see these guys, out having fights and all that stuff, and then playing a bit of jazz in a club.
So, in some ways, when I was putting it together, nobody's ever said this in a review, but I would call it. It's not a war novel; it's almost a campus novel. In my head, that it's about all these young boys going away. If it was 50, 60 years later, it'd be going away to university, not going away to war. They all go. They meet people from all different backgrounds, and certainly when I was at university, half the people there started bands in the first couple of weeks.
Yeah, so, that's really true.
It was indie bands when I was at uni, but back then it would have been jazz. So.
The idea, I think, that the kind of part of the worst part of war in general is waiting, and they're waiting to you know, be set free, and it reminded me a bit of Catch-22 in that way, where, you know, they're kind of thinking, right, we're finished now, and then they get told that they have to fly more flights and more, and the kind of madness that surrounded that.
2 more weeks, 3 more weeks, 4 more weeks.
Exactly. So then, why the jump from that book to Selma Hill?
Selma Hill was, this is going to sound strange, and my publisher probably wouldn't like me saying it, Selma Hill was never supposed to be a book.
Right.
When I originally conceived it, the first time solo was a difficult book to write. I threw 2 full drafts, about more than 200,000 words, in the bin, and the version that was eventually published was the 3rd version written from scratch. So by the time I did that and then went through the editing process, I was just burnt out from it. But because the editing took so long, I had all this kind of creativity building up that when I'm working on a novel, I don't work on anything else. I don't do short stories or anything while I'm doing that. I can only concentrate on the book. So as soon as I finished it, there was like this explosion of short stories and poems and everything. And I'd had 2 things I'd wanted to write about for a very long time. One was there's a statue, an icon in the National Museum of Scotland called the Balhulish Figure, which is a wonderful, wonderful, creepy piece. It's an old pagan idol that was pulled out of a peat bog in Aberdeenshire. And every time I go back to Edinburgh, I go to the museum and I go and see it, and it scares the crap out of me. There's something really, it's like a big black wooden figure with like gold brass, or
this is ringing a bell. Which museum is it?
The National Museum in Edinburgh. It's downstairs in the religious bit, and I think it was Andy Goldsworthy did a wood lattice thing behind it, so it's really well presented, and it always sparked some kind of weird like genetic memory or cultural memory inside me, and I always wanted to write about it. It kind of grabbed me, but I tried a few things and I couldn't really get anything to work. But I wrote a wee Twitter short story, one of these 140 character things, for the museum ran a competition, write about something in the museum in 140 characters, and no prize or anything as far as I remember. So I wrote that, didn't win, it wasn't a very good story, but one of the guys called Jeff Sanders, I think his name is, that's really going to embarrassing if I've got that wrong, read the story. He's an archaeologist at the museum. He read the story and sent me a PDF of the original find report, and it was found by a Church of Scotland minister in Aberdeenshire, and that sparked
there's something going here.
Something there. That's interesting. At the same time, I was reading, because I'd been working on this serious book, I started reading a lot of fun things, and a lot of Stevenson, and a lot of Alexandre Dumas, like the Three Musketeers series. I'd never read like the full all the way to the end, and I hadn't read Katrina by Stevenson, and I hadn't read The Master of Ballantrae. So I was reading all of those at the same time and caught up in this sort of like adventure, short chapters, fast-paced cliffhangers, and I was like, right, I want to write that kind of story as a writer's holiday. Virginia Woolf spoke about writer's holidays, which wrote Orlando. It was like, this serious book's done, I want to write something fun, and enjoyable. And that's what started Selma Hill. I started writing about the idol being found and unleashing accusations of witchcraft and spirits and things like that. And the first draft was that. It was fun and adventurous, and it kind of got all that creativity, that burst of creativity out while I was thinking about what my second book was supposed to be. What serious literary topic I was going to tackle next. And
a bit of a swashbuckling, I'm going to...
And I showed it to... I've got a kind of reading, editing relationship with Simon Sylvester, who wrote The Visitors. Very, very good book. So he and I have been friends for a long time, and we show each other all our work. So I showed him the early version of Selma Hill, and he said, "This is great. Turn it into a proper book. Take out the stupid things, take out the bad jokes and the puns and stuff that I put in when I'm not being edited, and turn it into a proper book. Take it seriously." So I did. I rewrote it, added kind of the entire section from when the character Henry Trent comes in. Added all of that, showed it to my agent and showed it to Freight, and they said, yeah, book number 2.
Fantastic.
Great. So it's sort of lucky accident in some ways.
Is it a world that you think you might return to? Did you know there are successful television shows these days which sound very similar to that?
Yeah, I've got an idea for a novel involving that character, Henry Trent, sort of a prequel in the same universe, but not connected to the story, and not witchcraft kind of stories. Just that sort of era. I like science. I like writing about scientists, and in that book, Trent is sort of an amateur gentleman scientist. So I'd like to return and write about that at some point.
You see, you like science, and Carrie is a
volcanologist.
I would say volcanologist. That sounds like a Star Trek.
Yes, but depends how you spell it. But yeah.
So is science, is that one of your real kind of passions in that?
It was when I was younger, and I sort of had, this is not a bad experience at school. Science at school didn't quite capture me the way literature did. But I almost went to university to study biomedical sciences or genetics.
Right. Okay.
And literally about 2 weeks before term started, I phoned them up and said, I want to change to English and philosophy. And they thought I was taking the piss. They thought it was a crank call.
Yeah.
But best decision I ever made. But I've always had an amateur enjoyable interest in science, but I sort of forgot about it all until I read. So I spoke about reading Andrew O'Hagan's book. The other book that sort of helped spark this book is Pippa Goldsmith's The Falling Star, which is about an astronomer. And I read that, and it brought back to me something that I'd thought previously and sort of forgotten about and dismissed, that it's bizarre how few literary novels are written about science and scientists. We're brilliant at writing about writers and musicians and painters and actors and directors, and not so good about writing about, or not so good, we just don't write about scientists, which I'm pleased there's so many more doing now. Pippa's doing it. She edited an anthology, and there's all these great writers writing about science and scientists, and it kind of just excited me. I was like, I want to do that. I want to get involved. I want to, I love science. I love geology. I've always been fascinated. When I was a kid, for family holidays, we would go up into the Highlands every summer and go walking around the Cairngorms and Skye and those kind of places. So it always just been like an amateur passion, which I know nothing about in terms of what kind of rock that is and how it was made. But I just thought, I want to write. I want my character to be a scientist. I want to.
So you're glad you chose literature and philosophy?
Yeah, in retrospect.
I tell people I'm glad I chose that. They don't believe me when I tell them. I said, honestly, it was the best thing I ever did.
Yeah, I still love it. But if I'd spent 4 years in a lab, I think I'd have cracked up. So
easier to get funded. But that's a different story.
Easier to get funded, a lot less easy to do your homework in bed.
That's true. That's very true. Like hunks of rock into the room. When you spoke a lot about Andrew Hagan there and Pippa Goldsmith, what are other influences or other writers at the moment that you admire particularly?
At the moment, there's so many. The last 2 or 3 years, particularly in Scotland, have been wonderful.
Yeah, I agree.
For new writers, for debut writers, and for writers really hitting their stride. Think about people that have come out in the last year: Kirsten Innes and Simon Sylvester and Jane Alexander, Maggie Ritchie, Margaret Montgomery. Writers like Andrew Raymond Drennan, The Limits of the World. It's his 4th book, I think, 3rd book.
That was his 3rd book.
3rd book, and it's such a phenomenally good book. There's just been so much in the last few years, and there's more coming. Helen Sedgwick's novels coming out in a few months. Me too, and I do some reading and some editing for my publisher Freight, so some of the stuff I've read that's coming down the pipeline is just fantastic as well. So it's kind of
It's interesting, I think, because there's maybe there's not less places to get published, but there's certainly, it's more difficult, I think, to perhaps get onto a large publisher.
Yeah.
But there are now all these fantastic small publishers that seem to be really championing, not even local authors, just authors that they really have a great relationship with.
I think it's, in some ways, I think it's an unintended but pleasant consequence of the lack of money in publishing.
I think you're right.
Because
I think you're right.
the small publishers like Freight and Cargo and Saraband and those kind of publishers, I would imagine, I don't know, I haven't seen any of their books, but I would imagine their financial books, but I would imagine couldn't afford to pay Irvin Welsh's advance or Ali Smith's advance.
Yeah.
So they all go with Faber or whoever. But the big publishers won't take the risks on people like me, people like Kirsten Innes, people like Jane Alexander. So it's sort of split the industry in a way that the smaller publishers are focusing much more on the newer writers, while the mainstream publishers are publishing the bigger writers. Although saying that, Freight got Janice Galloway's most recent.
Well, again,
that's
maybe tells its own story.
Yeah.
I mean, you obviously collections of short stories, I think, or something else, which have actually prospered through smaller publishers publishing them, whereas bigger publishers might go short stories. Nobody reads short stories.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a shame.
So, what is next for you after this book? Or is it too early to say?
I'm not sure. I've got in, I think, November, I've got a small poetry collection coming out, a collection of haiku-ish poems. There's a small poetry press in Aberdeenshire called Tap Saltiri. That's done people like Callum Roger, and there's one coming out of Cape too. So they're doing that. That's called Fractures. So that's the next thing. In terms of novels, I've got a couple of ideas. I'm not sure which is quite grabbed me yet, which one I'm going to pursue. It'll be something new, probably something set in Japan. I really want to use my knowledge and my experience, but also it's so much easier to do research if you're already living there. Setting a book in Hawaii, New Zealand and Scotland and England, Japan and Korea is not a great idea in terms of research and
unless you have a huge advance on you.
That would be nice, but no, it was mostly Google Maps and Google Street View for a lot of that.
I mean, you mentioned Andrew Raymond Brennan's book. I think what's incredible about that is that you really get a sense of place of Korea.
I know.
We know he's not been there. It's a really amazing book. And there's been a few books recently, actually. I'm thinking of David Simon's book. Eternal Sense of What is Beautiful. I think that's what it's called.
An Exquisite Sense.
Exquisite Sense.
That's a really good book about Japan.
Absolutely fabulous, isn't it?
Great. And Nicholas Hogg's Tokyo, of course, was fantastic. It's a lot of books about Japan are very, very good and very, very well written, but they tend to go one of two ways. They go the aesthetic, isn't it beautiful, isn't it the cherry blossoms and that kind of thing, the poetry and the art and beauty of the country, or they go, isn't it weird being a foreigner in a country like Japan? And what is brilliant about Nicholas Hogg's book is that it's the first time I've read a novel that shows Japan as I experience it, as I live there. That it's just a normal Japan with none of the romanticism and none of the stereotypes. It's just a straight, this is actually what living in Japan for a foreigner is like, and what Japan is like, certainly after the tsunami and the earthquake and the meltdown. It's a very good book.
But there is obviously a kind of eternal attraction, not just for Scots, but for that part of the world, and to kind of to write about it. So I take it's still different enough that it kind of retains its interest kind of on a daily basis.
I mean, I'm basically settled there now. It's more. Not more my home, not emotionally, but physically, it's it's where I live. It's where my wife is. It's we've just bought a house. So it's yeah, it's very much embedded in my psyche now, so I think it'd be very difficult not to write about it.
Yeah, sure. And you're going to, once you've kind of finished up in Glasgow, you are going up to Aberdeen.
Yeah.
Has it been a while since you've been there?
For any length of time, I flew into Aberdeen. I always fly into Aberdeen when I come back, because I think my mum would be a bit disappointed if I just said I'm going to Glasgow to see my friends.
Sure.
So
yeah, that's true.
It was nice to spend the weekend there, and
because I always think when I've not been to Aberdeen for a while, you go back and you think this is not like any other city in the UK. You know, there are bits of Glasgow that are a little bit like Dundee, and there are bits of or Paisley or Liverpool or something, but Aberdeen seems to be. I don't know whether it's the stone.
It's a big part of it.
It's the thin pavements.
Yeah.
The coldest I ever was at Pittodrie when I was young. There's something about it that kind of seems to be unique.
Yeah, I mean, things like the stone, the granite does give a visual difference. It does look very different from most places. I don't know what Aberdeen was like from my own experience before the oil.
Sure.
So that obviously had to have had a huge impact, and a huge influx of people not from Aberdeen, people from America, people from England, people from all over the world working in the oil industry, all come to Aberdeen, and that changed. I mean, Aberdeen's got, for a city that size, there's an amazing array of restaurants, different kinds of food, that kind of thing. Even in the last 10 years since I first left, it's become so much more multicultural than it ever was. I was walking down Union Street yesterday, and the number of different languages you hear as you're walking out, it's just wonderful. It's so nice to see, because obviously Aberdeen's so far north and so damn cold that if I was coming from Europe or Africa or Asia to come and live in Britain, I maybe wouldn't go that far up the coast before settling.
There's got to be a reason that you want to get there. But of course you get some of those beautiful countryside around there as well. Well, I think that's the perfect place to leave it. Ian, thanks. I'm so pleased to meet you.
You too. Thank you very much for having me on.
And I have to say, the book is tremendous. I've read it and absolutely loved it. I think it's a real coming of age as a writer, I have to say.
Thank you.
I look forward to whatever you do next.
Great, thank you.
And we'll be back next time with something completely different. Cheers.